I never thought a simple Tuesday afternoon service call would change everything I thought I knew about myself. My name is David Martinez, and I've been running Martinez Home Services here in Oakwood, Texas for the past 12 years. I fix what's broken, replace what's worn out, and help people get their lives back to normal. At least that's what I tell myself when I'm driving between jobs. Toolbox rattling in the back of my pickup truck. But that Tuesday, when I knocked on the door of 1247 Maple Street, I had no idea I was about to discover that some things that appear perfectly functional on the surface are actually falling apart on the inside. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house stood modest and neat, white picket fence freshly painted, garden beds lined with autumn mums that someone clearly tended with care. Everything looked exactly as it should, which is usually how I prefer my service calls to go. Simple, straightforward, no complications. I've learned that complications in this business usually mean either more work for the same pay, or customers who can't decide what they actually want fixed. But sometimes complications mean something entirely different, something that reaches deeper than clogged pipes or faulty wiring. The woman who answered the door looked exactly like someone who had her life completely together. Her name was Linda Thompson, and she wore a crisp blue sweater that matched her eyes. Her graying hair pulled back in a way that suggested she took time with her appearance, even on ordinary weekdays. She smiled politely and led me around to the side of the house where the dryer vent needed attention. It's professional, courteous, the kind of customer who probably had everything scheduled and organized weeks in advance. I remember thinking how refreshing it was to meet someone who seemed so composed. In my line of work, I encounter a lot of stress. People call me when their day has gone sideways, when the washing machine floods the basement or the garage door refuses to open and they're late for work. But Linda appeared calm, almost serene, as she showed me the problematic vent that had been backing up and causing her dryer to take twice as long to finish a load. She explained the issue clearly, answered my questions about when the problem started, and then excused herself to let me work. Standard procedure, exactly what I expected. I set up my equipment and got to business, pulling apart the external vent cover, feeding my snake through the ductwork to clear out years of accumulated lint and debris. The work was routine, meditative even, the kind of task that lets your mind wander while your hands stay busy. About 30 minutes into the job, Linda reappeared with a glass of sweet tea. Condensation beating on the outside in the October heat that still lingered in East Texas. She set it on the patio table nearby and lingered, watching me work, not hovering, just present in a way that suggested she had time and maybe wanted some company. I've learned to read these signals over the years. Some customers want you invisible, in and out without disrupting their day. Others seem hungry for conversation, for the simple human contact that comes with having someone else in their space. We started talking about ordinary things, the weather, how long I'd been in business, whether I thought the vent would give her any more trouble after this cleaning. Safe topics, the kind of small talk that fills comfortable silence. But there was something in her voice, a careful quality that made me pay closer attention. She spoke like someone choosing her words, deliberately, as if she were translating her thoughts before speaking them aloud. When I mentioned that I'd been doing this work for over a decade, she asked if I enjoyed it. Simple question, but something about the way she asked made me pause. Most people assume that if you're self-employed, you must love what you do, or they don't think about it at all. But Linda asked like someone who genuinely wanted to know, like the answer mattered to her personally. I told her the truth, that I'd started the business after my divorce because I needed something that was completely mine, something I could control when everything else felt chaotic. I mentioned that I liked solving problems, liked the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken and leaving them better than I found them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I didn't say was that somewhere along the way, the work had become a place to hide. A routine that kept me busy enough to avoid thinking too hard about what I actually wanted from life. She nodded thoughtfully and said she understood the appeal of having something that belonged entirely to you. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that she'd been thinking lately about what that might feel like. The comment struck me as odd, but I was focused on clearing a particularly stubborn blockage, so I filed it away and kept working. As I finished cleaning the ductwork and began reassembling the external components, Linda settled into one of the patio chairs, still sipping her tea. The afternoon light was shifting, casting longer shadows across her yard, and she seemed in no hurry for me to finish and leave. This happens sometimes, especially with customers who live alone or work from home. The presence of another person, even someone there to perform a service, breaks up the isolation of their day. She started telling me about the house, how she and her husband had bought it 15 years ago when he got transferred to Oakwood for his job at the regional bank. She described their plans for renovations, the garden they'd planted together, the way they'd imagined their future unfolding in these rooms in this yard. Her voice carried a wistful quality, like she was remembering a movie she'd seen long ago. I asked if her husband was at work, making conversation while I tested the vent to ensure proper airflow. She paused before answering, and when she spoke, her voice had changed subtly. She said yes, he was at the bank, same as every day for the past 15 years. Same routine, same schedule. Same conversations about practical matters, like mortgage payments and retirement planning, and whether they needed to replace the gutters before winter. Something in her tone made me look up from my work. She was staring at her garden, but her expression suggested she was seeing something else entirely. I've learned to recognize that look over the years, the expression people wear when they're having thoughts they're not sure they should voice aloud. It's the same look I probably wore during those last months of my marriage, when I was starting to acknowledge truths I'd been avoiding. She caught me watching her and smiled, but it was a different smile than the one she'd greeted me with at the door. This one carried weight, like she was deciding whether to say something that couldn't be taken back once it left her lips. I went back to my tools, giving her space to choose her words, but I found myself listening more carefully to the silence between us. That's when she said it so quietly, I almost missed it over the sound of me packing up my equipment. She said she'd been married for 22 years, and lately she felt like she was disappearing, becoming invisible even to herself. She said she couldn't remember the last time someone had really looked at her, really seen her as anything other than a function to be performed or a role to be filled. I stopped what I was doing and turned to face her fully. There was something raw in her voice, something that demanded attention. She was looking directly at me now, and I could see that she was deciding whether to continue, whether to cross some invisible line that separated polite customer conversation from genuine human connection. She told me that watching me work, seeing how much care I put into a simple maintenance task, reminded her of how it felt to matter to someone. She said I approached the job like it was important, like her problem was worth solving properly, and that she hadn't felt that kind of attention in longer than she could remember. Her husband, she explained, had stopped noticing her years ago, stopped seeing her as anything other than the person who managed the household and showed up at bank functions when required. The conversation had shifted into territory I wasn't prepared for, but I found myself unable to look away or change the subject. There was something compelling about her honesty, the courage it took to admit these things to a stranger. I set down my tools completely and gave her my full attention, something that felt both natural and slightly dangerous. She continued talking, words coming faster now like water through a broken dam. She told me about mornings when she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and couldn't recognize the woman looking back at her. About dinner conversations that consisted entirely of logistics and schedules. About lying awake at night feeling like she was suffocating under the weight of expectations she couldn't even name anymore. Then she stopped abruptly, seeming to realize how much she'd revealed. She apologized, said she didn't know why she was telling me all this, that I probably had other calls to get to. I found myself saying that I had time, that sometimes it helps to say things out loud to someone who won't judge or try to fix everything with simple solutions. That's when she looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been hope. She said that talking to me, having someone really listen without trying to manage or redirect the conversation, made her remember what it felt like to be seen as a whole person. And then she said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. She said, "David, I'm 48 years old, but talking to you today makes me feel like I'm 25 again. Not because you're trying to charm me or because there's anything inappropriate happening here, but because you're treating me like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. You're seeing me, really seeing me, and I'd forgotten what that felt like. The weight of her words settled between us like something physical. I understood exactly what she meant, because in that moment I realized she was seeing me too, not just the handyman who showed up to fix her dryer vent, but the person underneath. The one who'd been going through the motions of his own life without really examining whether those motions added up to anything meaningful. We sat there in her backyard as the afternoon stretched toward evening, to people who'd accidentally stumbled into a moment of genuine connection. Neither of us planned it, neither of us was looking for it, but there it was, honest and complicated, and impossible to ignore. The dryer vent was fixed, but something much more significant had been uncovered in the process. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that makes you want to stay under the covers and pretend the world can wait. But I had 3 service calls scheduled. Routine has a way of pulling you forward even when your mind wants to linger somewhere else. I found myself thinking about Linda Thompson while I loaded my truck, wondering if she was awake yet, if she was having second thoughts about our conversation, if she was regretting how much she'd shared with a stranger. My first call was a garbage disposal replacement in the newer subdivision across town. The kind of house where everything was beige and safe and exactly what you'd expect. The homeowner was pleasant enough, but our interaction felt hollow after yesterday's unexpected depth. I fixed his problem efficiently, collected my payment, and moved on to the next address. But something felt different about the work now. I kept thinking about what Linda had said about being seen. It's about mattering to someone, and I realized I'd been sleepwalking through most of my customer interactions for years. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart did something complicated when I read it. "David, this is Linda Thompson. I hope it's okay that I got your number from your business card. I wanted to thank you for listening yesterday and to apologize if I made you uncomfortable. I don't usually share so much with people I barely know." I stared at the message for longer than necessary, sitting in my truck outside a hardware store where I'd stopped for supplies. Part of me wanted to respond immediately, but another part warned me to be careful. Customer relationships were supposed to stay professional, and yesterday had definitely crossed some invisible line. But there was something about her honesty that made conventional boundaries feel artificial and unnecessary. I typed back carefully. No apology needed. Sometimes we all need someone to really listen.
Oh.
I'm glad I could be that person for you yesterday. I hesitated before adding, and if I'm being honest, talking with you made me think about some things in my own life that I've been avoiding. Her response came quickly. "Would you like to have coffee sometime? I know a place downtown that makes excellent pie." Nothing inappropriate, just 2 people who seemed to understand something about feeling invisible. I found myself smiling at the phone screen. There was something refreshing about her directness. The way she acknowledged the complexity of what was happening between us without pretending it was something it wasn't. I agreed to meet her Saturday morning at Rosie's Cafe on Main Street, a place I'd driven past countless times but never entered. The rest of the week passed in a strange haze of anticipation and second-guessing. I caught myself paying more attention to conversations with customers, really listening, instead of just waiting for them to explain their problems so I could fix them and move on. Mrs. Patterson, whose kitchen faucet I repaired on Thursday, mentioned that her arthritis was acting up with the weather change. Instead of nodding politely and focusing on my work, I found myself asking about her treatments, learning that she'd been dealing with joint pain for over a decade, but rarely talked about it because she didn't want to burden anyone. By the time she handed me a plate of homemade cookies with my payment, I realized this was what Linda had been talking about. The simple act of being genuinely interested in someone's experience, treating them like a whole person rather than just a source of income, created a connection that benefited both of us. Mrs. Patterson seemed energized by having someone care about her struggle, and I felt more purposeful than I had in months. Saturday morning found me standing outside Rosie's Cafe 15 minutes early, checking my reflection in the storefront window and wondering what exactly I was doing. I'd chosen my clothes carefully, dark jeans and a clean button-down shirt that struck a balance between casual and respectful. This wasn't a date. But it wasn't exactly a business meeting either, and I found myself in unfamiliar territory without a clear roadmap. Linda arrived precisely on time, wearing a soft green sweater and a smile that seemed both nervous and determined. She looked different somehow, more vibrant than she had in her backyard that Tuesday afternoon. We exchanged slightly awkward greetings and found a corner booth where we could talk without feeling like the entire cafe was listening to our conversation. The morning started safely enough. We ordered coffee and discussed neutral topics like the weather and local news. But there was an undercurrent of anticipation, as if we were both waiting for the conversation to find its real purpose. Linda mentioned that she'd been thinking about our talk all week, that something about voicing her feelings out loud had shifted something inside her. She told me she'd started paying attention to moments when she felt most like herself versus times she felt like she was performing a role someone else had written for her. She said the realization was both liberating and terrifying, because once you start noticing the difference, it becomes impossible to ignore. She described feeling like she'd been living her life in black and white for so long that she'd forgotten color existed, till someone reminded her what it looked like. I found myself sharing more than I'd intended about my own recent observations. I told her about Mrs. Patterson and the cookies, about how changing the way I approached my work had made me realize how disconnected I'd become from the people around me. I admitted that my divorce 3 years ago had left me wary of deep connections, that I'd chosen the safety of surface-level interactions over the risk of genuine intimacy. Linda listened with the same focused attention she'd shown in her backyard, asking questions that showed she was really processing what I was saying rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. She wondered aloud whether we'd both learn to protect ourselves by becoming smaller, or by expecting less from our interactions with others and therefore offering less of ourselves in return. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, punctuated by comfortable silences and shared laughter when the cafe's ancient coffee machine made sounds like a dying car engine. Linda had ordered apple pie, and she ate it slowly, savoring each bite in a way that suggested she didn't often allow herself such simple pleasures. When I commented on this, she paused with her fork halfway to her mouth and admitted that she couldn't remember the last time she'd ordered dessert without feeling guilty about it. This led to a longer discussion about the small ways we deny ourselves joy or satisfaction, how we learn to minimize our own desires in service of other people's expectations or comfort. Linda talked about how she'd gradually stopped buying books she wanted to read, stopped listening to music that made her feel energetic, stopped wearing colors that made her happy because they didn't fit the image of a serious banker's wife. I found myself admitting that I'd done something similar after my divorce, choosing emotional numbness over the possibility of getting hurt again. I told her about hobbies I'd abandoned, friends I'd gradually stopped calling, dreams I'd filed away as impractical or selfish. We realized we'd both become experts at living carefully, at choosing safety over fulfillment, and that the cost had been higher than either of us had wanted to acknowledge. As the morning stretched into afternoon, other customers came and went, but we remained anchored in our corner booth, discovering that we had far more in common than a chance encounter should have produced. We both loved old movies but rarely watched them anymore. We both enjoyed hiking but had convinced ourselves we were too busy for such luxuries. We both missed the feeling of being excited about the future rather than simply enduring the present. Linda mentioned that she'd been married so long she'd forgotten who she was before she became half of a couple. She described feeling like she'd lost track of her own preferences and opinions. She automatically deferred to her husband's choices about everything from restaurants to vacation destinations to the color of their living room walls. She said she sometimes caught herself agreeing with things she didn't actually believe, just to avoid conflict or the exhaustion of having to defend her perspective. I understood this more than I wanted to admit. Even in my solitary life, I realized I'd been living according to other people's definitions of success and happiness. I'd built a business that was profitable and respected, lived in a house that was appropriate for a man my age, maintained a routine that looked responsible from the outside. But I couldn't remember the last time I'd made a choice based purely on what I wanted rather than what seemed expected or practical. The realization was both sobering and oddly exciting. Linda put words to something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. She said it felt like we'd both been living our lives in translation, constantly converting our authentic impulses into acceptable versions before acting on them. She wondered what would happen if we started making decisions based on what energized us, rather than what seemed safe or appropriate. We began talking about small rebellions, tiny acts of authenticity that might help us reconnect with whoever we'd been before we learned to edit ourselves so carefully. Linda mentioned wanting to take a pottery class she'd seen advertised at the community center, something that had caught her attention but that she'd dismissed as frivolous. I found myself telling her about a woodworking project I'd been thinking about for months. A piece of furniture I wanted to build not because anyone needed it, but because the process appealed to me. These seemed like modest goals, but talking about them felt significant, like we were planning something subversive rather than just acknowledging our own interests. Linda laughed and said it was ridiculous that wanting to make things with our hands felt like an act of rebellion. But that's exactly what it felt like after years of focusing exclusively on practical necessities. As afternoon shadows began lengthening, across the cafe floor, Linda glanced at her watch and mentioned that her husband would be expecting her home soon. The reminder of the outside world felt jarring after hours of conversation that had existed in its own separate space. She gathered her purse and sweater, but neither of us seemed ready for the interaction to end. Standing outside the cafe, Linda thanked me again for listening, for treating her like someone worth knowing, rather than just someone to fix things for. She said our conversations, both in her backyard and this morning, had reminded her that she used to be someone who had opinions and dreams and preferences. That those parts of herself hadn't disappeared, but had just been buried under years of trying to be what everyone else needed. I told her that spending time with her had been equally meaningful for me, that her courage in examining her own life was inspiring me to look more honestly at mine. We stood there for a moment, two people who'd accidentally discovered that connection. It was still possible that authenticity was still an option, even when it felt dangerous or impractical. Before parting ways, Linda asked if I'd be interested in meeting again the following week. She said she'd signed up for that pottery class and wondered if I might want to hear about it, maybe share updates on the woodworking project we'd discussed. There was something hopeful in her voice, a quality I hadn't heard from her before, like she was beginning to believe that change was actually possible. I agreed immediately, surprised by how much I was already looking forward to it. We made plans to meet the following Saturday, same time and place. And I watched her walk to her car with a lighter step than I'd seen before. Something was shifting for both of us, some long dormant part of ourselves waking up after years of careful sleep. Driving home, I found myself thinking about the pottery class Linda had mentioned, about the courage it took to walk into a room full of strangers and admit you wanted to learn something new. I thought about my own woodworking project, about the satisfaction of creating something beautiful rather than just fixing what was broken. For the first time in years, I felt curious about my own future, eager to see what might be possible if I stopped limiting myself to what seemed safe or expected. The afternoon sun felt warmer than it had in months. I realized I was looking forward to Monday morning in a way I hadn't experienced since starting my business. Not because anything dramatic had changed in my external circumstances, but because I was beginning to remember what it felt like to be fully present in my own life, to engage with the world as someone who mattered rather than someone who was, just trying to get through the day without causing problems. That evening, I found myself sketching designs for the piece of furniture I wanted to build, something I hadn't done since high school shop class. The lines felt uncertain at first, my hand unsteady after years of disuse, but gradually the movements became more confident, more purposeful. I stayed up later than usual, lost in the pleasure of imagining something that didn't yet exist, but that I had the power to bring into being. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep feeling excited about tomorrow. 3 weeks into our Saturday morning coffee meetings, I started noticing changes in Linda that went beyond the obvious ones. She'd begun wearing brighter colors, asking for what she wanted instead of automatically agreeing with whatever suggestion the waitress made, speaking with more authority when she talked about her pottery class progress. But there were subtler shifts too, the way she held her shoulders straighter, how her laugh came more easily, the confidence in her voice when she disagreed with something I said during our discussions. The pottery class had become more than just a weekly activity for her. She talked about it with genuine excitement, describing the meditative quality of working with clay, the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands that existed purely because she wanted it to exist. She'd made several small bowls and was working on a larger piece, a vase with an intricate pattern that required patience and skill she was still developing. When she showed me photos on her phone, I could see the pride in her eyes, the joy of someone rediscovering their own capability. My woodworking project had evolved similarly. What started as vague sketches had become detailed plans for a dining table with hand-carved legs. Something far more ambitious than I'd originally envisioned. I'd purchased the wood and begun the initial cuts, working in my garage after finishing my service calls each day. The physical work felt different from my regular repairs, more personal and creative, requiring a different kind of attention and care. Linda had asked to see the progress, so that Saturday, I suggested we skip the cafe and meet at my house instead. I felt nervous showing her my workshop space. A converted 2-car garage filled with tools and lumber, and the half-finished table that represented something, couldn't quite name yet. But when she walked through the door and saw the project taking shape, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for and more. She moved around the workspace slowly, examining the wood grain and the partially carved details, asking thoughtful questions. About my process and techniques, she ran her fingers along the smooth surface I'd spent hours sanding, commenting on the warmth of the natural wood and the obvious care that had gone into each element. Having someone witness and appreciate the work felt unexpectedly meaningful, like I was sharing something essential about myself that I'd kept hidden for years. We spent the morning in the garage, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs, while I demonstrated different carving techniques and explained my vision for the finished piece. Linda proved to be an engaged student, asking to try some of the simpler tools and laughing when her attempts produced less than perfect results. There was something infectious about her willingness to be a beginner, to risk looking foolish in pursuit of understanding something new. During a break from the woodworking, we sat on my back deck, overlooking the small garden I'd been neglecting since my divorce. Linda noticed the overgrown flower beds and suggested we spend some time clearing weeds and replanting areas that had been taken over by wild growth. The idea appealed to me, partly because it would improve the appearance of my yard, but mostly because it meant extending our time together beyond our usual few hours. Working in the garden together felt natural and comfortable, our conversation flowing while we pulled weeds and discussed which plants might thrive in the changing season. Linda had a knowledge of gardening that surprised me, explaining drainage requirements and soil conditions with the authority of someone who'd spent years learning through trial and error. She mentioned that gardening had been one of her passions. Before marriage and household responsibilities consumed most of her free time. As we worked, she told me about the conversation she'd had with her husband the previous evening. The first time in months she'd tried to share something meaningful about her internal life. She'd mentioned the pottery class and her growing interest in creative pursuits, hoping he might show curiosity or encouragement about this new direction she was exploring. Instead, he'd responded with practical concerns about the cost and time commitment, questioning whether such activities were a wise use of resources when there were household projects that needed attention. The disappointment in her voice was unmistakable, but there was something else too, a firmness that hadn't been there in our earlier conversations. She said his reaction had clarified something important for her, helped her understand that waiting for permission or approval from others before pursuing her own interests was a choice she'd been making unconsciously. She realized she could continue making that choice, or she could decide that her own fulfillment was worth prioritizing regardless of other people's opinions. This revelation had led to a deeper examination of her marriage and the patterns they'd established over 2 decades together. She described feeling like they'd become business partners managing a household rather than 2 people who'd chosen to build a life together because they genuinely enjoyed each. They divided responsibilities efficiently, maintained their home and social obligations competently, but rarely connected as individuals with separate thoughts and dreams and desires. I found myself sharing similar observations about my own failed marriage, how we'd gradually stopped seeing each other as complete people, and instead related primarily through our designated roles and functions. The realization had been devastating at the time, but discussing it now with Linda helped me understand it as a common trap rather than a personal failure. We'd both learned to prioritize harmony and efficiency over authentic connection, not realizing that the cost would be losing ourselves in the process. Our gardening session stretched into the afternoon, punctuated by trips inside for water and snacks and brief rests in the shade when the work became too strenuous. Linda seemed reluctant to leave. I found myself suggesting projects that would extend her visit, partly because I was enjoying her company, but also because I sensed she was avoiding something waiting for her at home. Eventually, she confessed that her husband had planned an evening dinner party with his colleagues from the bank, an event she was expected to attend as the supportive spouse who would ensure everything ran smoothly while remaining charming, but largely invisible. She described these gatherings as performances where she played a role she'd perfected over the years, making small talk about topics that didn't interest her while monitoring drinks and refreshments and presenting herself as evidence of her husband's domestic stability. The prospect clearly exhausted her, but what struck me most was the way she talked about it as an obligation rather than a choice. She seemed genuinely surprised when I suggested that she could choose not to attend, could tell her husband that she had other plans, or simply didn't feel like participating in an event that drained her energy without providing any corresponding satisfaction. Linda sat back on her heels in the dirt, garden gloves hanging from her hands, considering this possibility as if I'd suggested something revolutionary rather than simply exercising normal adult autonomy. She said it had never occurred to her that disappointing her husband's expectations was an acceptable option, that she'd been operating under the assumption that avoiding conflict was always preferable to asserting her own preferences. This led to a longer conversation about the difference between being considerate and being self-erasing, between compromising in a relationship and disappearing into someone else's vision of who you should be. Linda began recognizing patterns, where she'd automatically deferred to her husband's preferences without even checking whether she had different opinions, assumptions she'd made about what a good wife should prioritize that had never been explicitly discussed or agreed upon. By late afternoon, Linda had made a decision that surprised both of us. She called her husband and explained that she wouldn't be attending the dinner party, that she had other commitments and hoped he could manage the evening without her assistance. The conversation was brief and clearly uncomfortable, but she delivered the message calmly and without excessive explanation or apology. After hanging up, she sat quietly for several minutes, processing what she'd just done. She said it felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, like stepping off a cliff, while discovering she could fly. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, but there was apprehension too. Awareness that challenging established patterns would likely create friction that she'd have to navigate carefully. We finished the garden work as evening approached, stepping back to admire the cleared beds and newly planted areas that would hopefully flourish in the coming weeks. The physical transformation of the space felt symbolic somehow, evidence that neglected things could be restored to beauty with attention and care. Linda commented that working with soil and plants reminded her of pottery, the satisfaction of nurturing something into existence through patient effort. As she prepared to leave, Linda thanked me not just for the day's activities, but for helping her remember that she had choices even in situations where she'd felt trapped by obligation and expectation. She said our friendship had become a mirror that reflected possibilities she'd forgotten existed, ways of being in the world that prioritized authenticity over approval. I told her that spending time with her had been equally transformative for me, that watching her courage in examining and changing her life was inspiring me to take similar risks in my own. The woodworking project had become more than just a hobby. It represented a commitment to creating beauty and meaning rather than simply maintaining functionality. Her willingness to disappoint others in service of her own growth was teaching me that self-respect sometimes required disappointing people whose approval I'd been seeking unconsciously. That evening, I worked late in the garage, making significant progress on the table's carved details while thinking about the day's conversations and revelations. The physical work felt meditative, each careful cut and curve requiring focus that quieted the analytical parts of my mind and allowed deeper understanding to emerge naturally. I realized that what Linda and I were developing went beyond friendship or mutual support. We were becoming witnesses to each other's transformation, people who could see and celebrate the authentic selves we were working to reclaim. This felt both precious and fragile, something that needed to be protected from external pressures and expectations that might try to pull us back into safer but smaller versions of ourselves. The next morning brought an unexpected text from Linda, sent earlier than she usually contacted me. She wrote that her husband had been furious about her absence from the dinner party, that their conversation when he returned home had escalated into the kind of argument he usually avoided through careful politeness and strategic silence. She said it had been painful but also clarifying, forcing them to acknowledge problems they'd been ignoring for years. Her message continued with updates that mixed anxiety and determination in equal measure. She'd signed up for additional pottery classes and was considering a part-time job at the art center where she'd been taking lessons. She'd also scheduled lunch with an old friend from college, someone she'd lost touch with during the years when her social life had become entirely dependent on her husband's professional relationships. Reading her words, I felt a complex mixture of pride and concern. I was thrilled to see her making bold choices and reclaiming parts of herself that had been dormant for too long. But I also worried about the toll this transformation might take on her marriage and the potential consequences she might face for refusing to remain invisible. My own life had been shifting in parallel ways, though perhaps less dramatically. I'd started declining service calls that felt purely transactional, choosing instead to focus on projects that allowed for meaningful interaction with customers who appreciated craftsmanship and personal attention. The change had resulted in slightly lower income but significantly higher satisfaction, a trade-off that felt worthwhile for the first time in my adult life. I'd also begun reaching out to old friends I'd lost touch with during my post-divorce. Retreat from social connection. These conversations felt awkward initially, but most people seemed genuinely pleased to hear from me and curious about what I'd been doing during my years of self-imposed isolation. Several had expressed interest in seeing my woodworking projects. I'd tentatively agreed to host a small gathering where I could share my workshop and catch up on years of missed conversations. The prospect of opening my home and creative space to others felt vulnerable but exciting, reminiscent of the nervousness I'd experienced before showing Linda my work for the first time. I was beginning to understand that meaningful connection required this kind of vulnerability. The willingness to let others see not just the polished exterior we present to the world, but the messy, perfect, authentic selves we usually keep hidden. As I prepared for another week of work, I found myself looking forward to Saturday's meeting with Linda with unusual anticipation. We'd planned to visit the art center where she was taking classes, and she'd arranged for me to meet her instructor and see some of the advanced students' work. The idea of entering a creative community felt both intimidating and energizing. It's like stepping into a world where the values I was beginning to embrace were not only accepted but celebrated. Change was accelerating for both of us, gathering momentum in ways that felt both thrilling and slightly out of control. I sensed we were approaching some kind of crossroads where the choices we'd been making privately would become visible to the larger world, requiring us to either commit fully to this new direction or retreat to the safety of our previous compromises. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of a diving board high, above water that might be deeper and more welcoming than it appeared from a distance. Linda had already taken the leap in many ways, and watching her navigate the turbulence with grace and determination was giving me courage to consider jumps of my own that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The moment I'd been dreading arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the form of an unexpected visitor. I was working under the kitchen sink of Mrs. Chen, replacing a corroded pipe fitting, when I heard my phone buzzing insistently from my toolbox. By the time I could wash my hands and check the messages, I had 3 missed calls from Linda and 2 voicemails marked urgent. Her voice in the first message sounded strained and careful, the way people talk when they know others might be listening. She said her husband had found out about our meetings, that someone from the bank had seen us together at the art center and mentioned it to him. She asked me to call her back, but said to be careful about timing because Robert was working from home that day and monitoring her activities more closely than usual. The second message was shorter and more direct. She said Robert wanted to meet with me, that he'd insisted on having what he called a clarifying conversation about my relationship with his wife. Linda's voice carried a warning I couldn't quite interpret. But the underlying message was clear. Our situation had become complicated in ways we hadn't anticipated. I finished Mrs. Chen's repair in a distracted haze, my mind racing through possible scenarios and their potential consequences. I'd been naive to think that our friendship could remain private indefinitely in a town the size of Oakwood, where everyone seemed connected to everyone else through work or church or family relationships. The art center visit had felt so natural and innocent that I hadn't considered how it might appear to outside observers who didn't understand the context of our connection. When I finally reached Linda that evening, she sounded exhausted but determined. She explained that Robert had confronted her with accusations ranging from emotional infidelity to financial irresponsibility, questioning not just our friendship, but every choice she'd made over the past 2 months. He demanded details about our conversations, expressed outrage about her pottery classes and her decision to miss the dinner party, and ultimately issued an ultimatum that she'll end all contact with me immediately. Linda's response had surprised even herself. Instead of apologizing or trying to explain away his concerns, she'd told him that her friendship with me was important to her and that she wouldn't be ending it based on his suspicions and demands. She said the conversation had escalated from there, with Robert threatening various consequences if she continued to defy his wishes about appropriate behavior for a banker's wife. The courage in her voice was unmistakable, but I could hear the cost it was exacting. She sounded like someone who'd been fighting a battle she never expected to have to fight, defending territory she'd only recently discovered belonged to her. When she mentioned Robert's request to meet with me, I could tell she was worried about what that conversation might entail and how it might affect our ability to maintain the friendship that had become so meaningful to both of us. I told her I was willing to meet with Robert if she thought it would help the situation, but I also wanted her to know that I wouldn't apologize for or misrepresent the nature of our connection. What we'd shared was honest and valuable to people, helping each other remember who they were beneath the roles and expectations that had accumulated over years of careful living. If Robert couldn't understand or accept that, the problem lay with his perspective rather than our behavior. We arranged for the meeting to take place the following Saturday morning at the same cafe, where Linda and I had been having our weekly conversations. The choice of location felt significant, a way of honoring the space where our friendship had deepened, while also providing a public setting that might encourage civility from all parties involved. The week leading up to the meeting passed with an uncomfortable tension that affected every aspect of my daily routine. I found myself second-guessing interactions with customers, wondering if someone might misinterpret professional friendliness as something inappropriate. I worked on my table project with less enthusiasm than usual, the creative flow interrupted by anxiety about defending choices that had felt so natural and positive when viewed from inside the experience. Linda and I exchanged a few brief texts during the week, mostly logistical coordination about the upcoming meeting, but I could sense the strain she was under in her careful word choices and formal tone. She was clearly being monitored more closely than before, and the freedom we'd both come to treasure was being constrained by external pressure that felt both unfair and inevitable. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavier than it should. I arrived at Rosie's Cafe 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly because I wanted to choose our seating arrangement before Robert arrived and potentially controlled that aspect of the interaction. I selected a corner booth that would allow for private conversation while remaining visible to other customers, a balance between intimacy and transparency that seemed appropriate for the circumstances. Robert Thompson arrived precisely on time, demonstrating the punctuality I'd expected from someone in his profession. He was shorter than I'd imagined, the carefully groomed graying hair and the kind of measured movements that suggested someone accustomed to being in control of situations. He wore a dark suit despite the weekend timing, projecting an authority that felt intentionally intimidating in the casual environment of the cafe. Linda arrived a few minutes later, looking pale but composed, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her appear both vulnerable and strong. The dynamics between the three of us felt immediately complex, with undercurrents of tension that had nothing to do with anything inappropriate and everything to do with competing visions of what Linda's life should look like. Robert began the conversation with what sounded like a prepared statement. thanking me for meeting with him and expressing his desire to clear up any misunderstandings about the situation. His tone was polite, but contained an edge that suggested he was accustomed to having his perspective accepted without question. He explained that he was concerned about his wife's recent behavior changes and the influence that outside relationships might be having on her decision-making process. I listened carefully, trying to understand not just his words but the assumptions underlying them. He spoke about Linda as if she were a valuable asset that required protection from bad influences, rather than an autonomous person capable of making her own choices about relationships and activities. His concerns seemed to center more on maintaining stability and appearances than on Linda's actual happiness or fulfillment. When he finished his opening remarks, I responded as calmly as I could manage. I acknowledged his concerns while explaining that my friendship with Linda had developed naturally from mutual respect and shared interests in creative pursuits and personal growth. I emphasized that our relationship was based on supporting each other's authentic development, rather than trying to change or influence each other in predetermined directions. Robert's response revealed the core of his discomfort. He couldn't understand why Linda needed external validation or encouragement for interests that seemed impractical or unnecessary given their established lifestyle and future plans. He viewed her pottery classes and our conversations as distractions from more important responsibilities, symptoms of some kind of midlife crisis that would hopefully resolve itself if left alone, or perhaps redirected toward more appropriate outlets. Linda had remained quiet during our initial exchange, but at this point she began speaking with a clarity that surprised both Robert and me. She explained that her recent changes weren't symptoms of confusion or outside manipulation, but rather the result of finally paying attention to parts of herself that she'd been ignoring for years. She said her friendship with me had been valuable not because I'd told her what to do, but because I'd listened to what she was trying to figure out for herself. Robert's discomfort with this explanation was visible in his body language and increasingly sharp tone. He questioned the appropriateness of Linda sharing personal matters with someone outside their marriage, suggesting that any problems she was experiencing should be discussed with him, or perhaps a professional counselor rather than a tradesman she'd met through a service call. The dismissive way he referred to my profession stung, but what bothered me more was his assumption that Linda's thoughts and feelings were problems to be solved rather than valid experiences deserving consideration and respect. I found myself defending not just our friendship but Linda's right to seek connection and understanding wherever she could find it, regardless of whether her husband approved of the source. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Robert becoming increasingly frustrated as it became clear that neither Linda nor Ray were going to accept his framing of the situation as inappropriate or problematic. He eventually shifted to more direct demands, insisting that Linda end our friendship and focus her energy on their marriage and his upcoming promotion that would require them to relocate to Dallas within the next 6 months. This was the first. Linda had heard about the promotion or the relocation plans, and her shock was evident in her immediate response. She asked why such a significant life change hadn't been discussed with her before decisions were made, why her own preferences and commitments weren't considered relevant to choices that would affect her as much as him. Robert's answer revealed more about their relationship dynamic than perhaps he intended. He explained that the promotion was an excellent opportunity for advancement and financial security, that the details were still being finalized, but that he'd wanted to ensure the position was confirmed before involving her in what he characterized as preliminary planning stages. He seemed genuinely surprised that she would expect to be consulted about career decisions that he viewed as primarily his responsibility. Linda's response was quiet but firm. She said she had no intention of moving to Dallas, as she'd finally found activities and relationships that were helping her become the person she wanted to be, and that abandoning those developments to support someone else's ambitions was no longer acceptable to her. She told Robert that if he wanted to take the promotion, he was free to do so, but she would be staying in Oakwood to continue building the life she was creating for herself. The silence that followed this declaration felt charged with implications that none of us were quite ready to name explicitly. Robert stared at Linda as if she'd spoken in a foreign language, clearly struggling to process her refusal to automatically prioritize his career over her own emerging interests and commitments. When he finally responded, his voice carried a coldness that made me understand why Linda had felt invisible in her marriage for so long. He told her that she was being selfish and unrealistic, that marriages required compromise and sacrifice from both partners, and that her recent behavior suggested she'd forgotten her responsibilities as his wife and partner. Linda's answer came, without hesitation, delivered with a confidence I'd never heard from her before. She said she'd been compromising and sacrificing for 22 years, that it was time for her to prioritize her own growth and happiness, and that if Robert couldn't support or at least respect that choice, they would need to have much more serious conversations about the future of their relationship. The meeting ended without resolution, with Robert leaving abruptly after making it clear that he considered Linda's position unacceptable and my influence on her decision-making inappropriate and unwelcome. Linda and I sat in the aftermath of his departure, both shaken by the intensity of the confrontation, but also oddly relieved that the underlying tensions had finally been brought into the open where they could be addressed directly. As we walked out of the cafe together, Linda thanked me for defending our friendship and for helping her find the courage to speak truthfully about her own needs and desires. She said the conversation had been painful but necessary, forcing her to confront choices she'd been avoiding about the kind of life she actually wanted to live rather than the one she'd been expected to accept. I told her that watching her stand up for herself had been inspiring, that her willingness to risk conflict in service of authenticity was teaching me important lessons about the difference between keeping the peace and actually living peacefully. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd both crossed a line that made retreat impossible, committing ourselves to paths that prioritize growth over comfort and truth over convenience. The future felt uncertain, but full of possibility, like standing at the beginning of a journey whose destination remained unknown but whose direction finally felt honest and hopeful. 6 months later, I stood in the doorway of what used to be Henderson's hardware store, watching Linda arrange handmade pottery on custom shelves I'd built specifically for her pieces. The morning sun streamed through windows we'd cleaned together the week before, casting warm light across clay bowls and vases that represented hundreds of hours of patient work and creative discovery. The transformation of the old store into Thompson Pottery Studio had taken 3 months of evenings and weekends. But seeing Linda in her own space, confident and purposeful as she prepared for the grand opening, made every hour of renovation work feel like time well spent. She moved with an energy I'd never seen before, someone who'd finally found the intersection of passion and purpose that had been missing from her carefully constructed life. Robert had taken the promotion in Dallas, moving there alone after Linda made it clear that their visions for the future were incompatible in ways it couldn't be resolved through compromise or counseling. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly amicable once they both accepted that neither was willing to become the person the other needed them to be. Linda had kept the house and used her settlement to fund the studio, while Robert found an apartment near his new job and began what he called a fresh start in a city where his ambitions could flourish without interference. My own life had shifted in directions I couldn't have imagined that Tuesday afternoon when I'd knocked on Linda's door to fix her dryer vent. The dining table I'd been working on was now the centerpiece of my own home. But more importantly, the confidence I'd gained from completing that project had led to a small business, building custom furniture for people who valued craftsmanship over mass production. Word had spread through the community about my work, and I found myself with a waiting list of customers who were willing to pay premium prices for pieces that would last generations. The financial success was gratifying, but what meant more was the satisfaction of creating things that brought beauty into people's lives rather than simply fixing what was broken. I'd learned the difference between work that pays the bills and work that feeds the soul, and I couldn't imagine returning to the purely functional approach that had defined my career for so many years. Linda and I had continued our Saturday morning meetings throughout our separation and divorce, though our conversations had evolved from mutual support through difficult transitions to planning sessions for our respective new ventures. She'd become my first customer for the studio furniture, commissioning display pieces that showcased her pottery while complementing the renovated space we'd created together. Our friendship had deepened beyond what either of us had expected. Built on shared values about authentic living and mutual respect for each other's creative processes, people in town had eventually stopped speculating about the nature of our relationship, accepting us as partners in the broader sense of two people who'd chosen to support each other's growth, without demanding conventional definitions or explanations. The grand opening celebration was scheduled for that afternoon. Half the town seemed excited to see what Linda had created in the months since her marriage ended. Mrs. Patterson had volunteered to help with refreshments, bringing the same enthusiasm she'd shown when I'd taken time to listen to her concerns about her arthritis. Sam from the electrical supply company had donated his services for the studio lighting, saying he admired anyone brave enough to start over at Linda's age. As the morning progressed, friends and neighbors stopped by to offer congratulations and preview the pottery before the official opening. Each visitor seemed genuinely impressed by the quality of Linda's work and the thoughtful design of the studio space. Watching her accept compliments with grace and confidence, I remembered the woman who'd apologized for sharing too much with a stranger, who'd worried about disappointing people by pursuing her own interests. The transformation was remarkable. But what struck me most was how natural it seemed now. As if this version of Linda had always existed beneath the surface, and it simply needed permission to emerge. She talked knowledgeably about different clay types and firing techniques, handled business questions with competence that surprised even her, and radiated the kind of satisfaction that comes from aligning daily actions with personal values. Around noon, an unexpected visitor appeared in the studio doorway. Robert stood there in a business suit that looked expensive but somehow diminished him in the casual, creative environment Linda had built. He looked around the space with an expression I couldn't quite read, taking in the pottery displays, the renovated interior, and Linda's obvious comfort in her new role as studio owner and artist. Linda handled the encounter with remarkable composure, greeting Robert politely and offering to show him around the studio if he was interested. There was no hostility in her manner, but also no apology or defensiveness about the choices she'd made since their separation. She spoke about her work with the same professional confidence she might have used with any visitor, treating him as someone genuinely curious about pottery rather than an ex-husband who'd opposed every step of her journey to this moment. Robert seemed unsure how to respond to this version of Linda, someone who was clearly thriving in ways that had nothing to do with his approval or support. He complimented the studio's appearance and acknowledged the quality of her pottery, though his tone suggested surprise that she'd been capable of such achievement. When he mentioned that his new position in Dallas was going well, Linda responded with genuine warmth, saying she was glad he'd found a situation that suited his ambitions. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it felt significant, as a demonstration of how completely Linda had moved beyond needing Robert's validation or fearing his disapproval. When he left, she returned to her preparations without missing a beat, focused on the afternoon's celebration rather than dwelling on the past or the man who'd been unable to see her potential when they were married. The grand opening exceeded every expectation Linda had harbored during the months of planning and preparation. The studio filled with customers, admirers, and supporters who appreciated both her artistic development and her courage in pursuing a dream that many people her age would have dismissed as impractical or too risky. Sales were strong enough to validate her business plan, but more importantly, the response confirmed that Oakwood was ready to support local artists who brought beauty and creativity to the community. I spent the afternoon helping with logistics and enjoying the celebration of someone whose friendship had changed my own life in profound ways. Watching Linda interact confidently with customers, explain her creative process to fellow artists, and accept orders for custom pieces, I felt proud of the role I'd played in encouraging her initial steps toward this new life. As evening approached, and the last visitors departed, Linda and I sat among the remaining pottery pieces. Exhausted but exhilarated by the day's success, she thanked me again for believing in her potential before she'd learned to believe in it herself, for providing support during the difficult months when everything familiar was changing, and for helping create the physical space where her dreams could become reality. I told her that supporting her journey had been as transformative for me as our friendship had been for her. That watching her courage had inspired changes in my own life that I might never have attempted alone. We'd both learned that authenticity was contagious, that surrounding yourself with people who valued growth over comfort made previously impossible choices seem not only feasible but necessary. The studio felt peaceful in the fading light, filled with pottery that represented hours of patient work and creative exploration. Linda picked up one of her favorite pieces, a large bowl with intricate patterns that had taken weeks to complete. Turning it slowly in her hands as she admired the way the glaze caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows, she said it felt surreal to be sitting in her own business, surrounded by art she'd created with her own hands, independent and confident in ways she'd never imagined possible during the years when she'd defined herself primarily through other people's expectations and needs. The woman who'd once described herself as tired of being the soft upholstery in someone else's life had become the architect of her own purposeful existence. As I prepared to leave that evening, Linda handed me a small pottery piece she'd made. Specifically for me, a simple cup with my initials carved into the handle. She said it was a small token of appreciation for someone who'd helped her remember that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. That courage often starts with having one person who sees your potential and believes in your ability to achieve it. Driving home with the cup on my passenger seat, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a routine dryer vent repair and evolved into a friendship that had reshaped both our lives. Neither of us had been looking for transformation that Tuesday afternoon, but we'd been open to connection when it appeared. Willing to support each other's growth even when the direction was uncertain and the outcomes unpredictable. The dining table I'd built stood in my kitchen when I arrived home, its hand-carved details catching the lamplight as I prepared a simple dinner. Tomorrow would bring new furniture orders, new opportunities to create beauty and meaning through careful craftsmanship. Linda's studio would welcome students eager to learn pottery techniques from someone who understood that art was about more than technical skill, that creativity could be a pathway to discovering your authentic self. Both learned that meaningful change often begins with small acts of courage, with choosing authenticity over approval and growth over comfort. Sometimes it takes meeting the right person at the right moment to remember that transformation is always possible, that it's never too late to start living the life you were meant to live rather than the one you've been expected to accept. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.